welcome back to the final part of the Jersey Devil. I want to say a quick thank you to those who have given this show a chance, to those who message me or leave comments about how much they enjoy the show, and to anyone who shares the podcast with others. This show takes months to research, write, produce, and so on. The comments, support, and enthusiasm really help when things aren't easy. But back to what you came here for. Our last episode covered dozens, if not hundreds, of sightings over the centuries. But let's be honest, we can't assume that every single sighting is 100% the truth. Now, I'm not saying that any of the witnesses were lying, but that they were maybe the victim of one of the many hoaxes inspired by the Jersey Devil. So we'll separate this much like we did the last episode. Hoaxes that took place before the week of 1909, hoaxes that took place during the week of 1909, and the hoaxes that came after. The first hoax that I could find record of was from Halloween 1830. In early October, Daniel Vliet had traveled to New York to do some shopping. He was strolling along Broadway when he noticed a display of strange masks. Intrigued, he chose the most frightening one and took it back home. Back in Vienna, which would later be known as Great Meadows, Daniel and his family enjoyed the mask, for a time. When its novelty wore off, Daniel gave it to farmhand Jack Sutton. Squire Fleming was walking by Whitesell's Corner on the outskirts of Vienna one night. As he walked, something tugged on his coattails. Maybe a stray dog? Well, after this happened several times, he whirled around to confront whatever it was. He shrieked as he came face to face with a white-robed figure with a hideous face. Fleming was so terrified that he ended up crashing through the doors of the Great Meadows Inn, collapsing to the floor. As Squire Fleming was a respected member of the community and a pillar of the church, local residents immediately believed his story. And to be fair, the man was borderline hysterical when he recounted this incident. He certainly wasn't lying that something had happened. The community knew of just one hideous monster in the area, so they all agreed that it must have been the Jersey Devil. Morris Cummins was walking past Whitesell's Corner. Now, Cummins had a habit of asking questions out loud to himself as he walked. On this night, he was startled when something answered one of his questions from a few feet behind him. What transpired next was exactly the same as Squire Fleming's story, except this time, Cummins fled in the opposite direction that Fleming had, bursting instead through the doors of the Vienna Hotel. One incident could be a fluke, but two? That definitely caused concern in the community. All were on the lookout for this mystery monster, particularly at night. The third incident came when carpenter Richard Hall was returning from the Vliet farm one night. Something you should know about Richard Hall was that he was strong, brave, and very much a no-nonsense kind of guy. So when a beast leapt from the bushes, barking like a dog, Hall stood his ground. It almost seems like he'd been waiting for the opportunity because he ripped a piece of fence from its post and beat the absolute shit out of his assailant. The barking quickly turned into words. "Don't kill me, I'm Jack Sutton." Despite this proof that there was a human under the robe and mask, Hall still took a few more swings for good measure. After he thoroughly whooped Sutton's ass, Hall threw down his makeshift bat in disgust and walked away. Sutton was never seen in the area again, a torn-up mask and sheet, the only things left on Whitesell's Corner. In the late 1880s, reports started to pop up of the Devil Kid in Cleveland, Ohio. This child had been born to, quote, a Polish family in the neighborhood of Newburgh. The detail that this demonic child was specifically from a Polish family, a specifically immigrant family, this descriptor was used to push an anti-immigrant sentiment that was popular at the time and probably still familiar today. This devil child seemed to share quite a few similarities with the Jersey Devil. Reddish skin, horns, claws, hooves, and a long pointy tail. Instead of Mother Leeds, it was the attending doctor to this horrifying birth that shouted, quote, "Great God, but we must kill this thing." However, making this version of the monster into an urban creature is what shortened its lifespan in the public eye. Think about it. Where the Jersey Devil had escaped and prowled in the pines, well, after this city monster's birth, was it going to prowl the alleyways like a stray dog or a street urchin? Even if it did, a gnarled and malformed child in the streets of Cleveland is a whole lot less scary than a shadowy monster darting about the Pine Barrens at night. The story had its moment of popularity as a horrifying tale, and then promptly died out. The only other spike in the graph was when the body of the Devil Kid apparently cycled in traveling displays across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Believe it or not, stories about grotesque births like this one and the Jersey Devil weren't at all uncommon. The frequency of these stories in the papers further cemented in the public mind that tragic monsters like this really did exist all around them. And though relatively rare, they were apparently being born at a consistent rate. The book The Secret History of the Jersey Devil noticed a parallel trajectory within the United States at the time. The American economy started to grow so quickly after the post-Civil War era slump that Mark Twain would name it the Gilded Age. After years of conflict with indigenous peoples at an end, striking out and settling west was now safer than ever before. And now there was the transcontinental railroad system, making it easier than ever before. The Industrial Revolution had also given a boost to the middle class. With all of this combined, it meant that it was easier and less stressful to simply survive. And they now had a little expendable income for entertainment. This prompted a boom of interest in the strange, the weird, and the bizarre. And therefore, stories like The Devil Kid and The Jersey Devil had voracious readers. This would continue on for quite some time, prompting some to take advantage of this interest. Alright, so now we're going to look into some of the hoaxes that contributed to the rising panic of the week of 1909. A small heads up that this is going to get a little disjointed, as details shuffle almost endlessly. It really depends on which source you believe. So I'm going to try to keep up with which source states what, so that we can more easily separate the true series of events, as well as which source is perpetuating what occurrences happened, and by whom. Let's start with some simple stuff. In December of 1929, Norman Jeffries admitted that he couldn't resist the opportunity to dress up as a kangaroo during the 1909 sightings and create some sightings of his own. However, he said that this happened in 1906. Yeah, you heard that right. He said he pulled that stunt in 1906, but the infamous week was in 1909. Since he was making this confession 20 years later, he might have just gotten his years mixed up. But he also might have just reverse engineered this story in order to insert himself into a historic event. A small number of the footprints from the week of 1909 were found to be faked, verified to be false prints that people had made in order to add to the excitement of the sightings. Quote, G.W. Green of Salem admitted in the 1960s, many years after the events, that he had made some of these prints to create additional action. No doubt there were other pranksters, but still, there is no logical explanation for the vast majority of the prints. That's still true. The dozen or so confessions of falsified prints doesn't explain the prints found on rooftops, or the prints that seem to hop fences. Not long after the week, the superintendent of the Philadelphia Zoo promised a $10,000 reward for the capture of the Jersey Devil, intending to build a special exhibit for it. This reward would be worth about $347,000 in 2024. The Philadelphia Press comedically offered $30,000, $25,000 for the Jersey Devil itself, and $5,000 for a signed interview with the capturer. This reward would be worth approximately $1,041,000 in 2024. Within days of these announcements, Walter Flint of George Street, New Brunswick, was startled when his son flew into the house, screaming that a strange beast was in the yard. The memory of these hefty rewards popped into Flint's mind. He leapt to his feet, seized a broom, and dashed out the door. I get that brooms were some of the objects most commonly on hand, but come on, people. He sprinted across the yard, brandishing his broom at a very startled possum. The Flints were good-humored enough to pass the story on to future generations. In Philadelphia in January, press agent Norman Jeffries read about this strange devil and got an idea. His boss, Charles Bradenberg, had a business that wasn't doing so great. But Jeffries explained to Bradenberg and business manager T.F. Hopkins that maybe the devil could save them. The plan that Jeffries explained to them very well could have gotten him fired, if this had been any other business. But Bradenberg ran the 9th and Arch Street Dime Museum, and in a museum specializing in crazy stunts, dubious displays, and questionable items, Jeffries' suggestion fit right in. Norman Jeffries teamed up with Jacob Hope. One source says he was an animal trainer, another says he was a taxidermist. The Secret History of the Jersey Devil says that Hope was a local taxidermist who then contacted an animal trainer and exhibitor, a mysterious Professor Edwards of Buffalo, New York. And then came the real dramatics. According to the book The Jersey Devil by James McCloy and Ray Miller, Jeffries started to prime the public for future events by claiming that Hope had had a mysterious creature in his possession, but it had escaped 2 weeks before. Quote, Hope proclaimed that he was anxious to have his thing returned, as it was, quote, the only rare Australian vampire in captivity before it escaped. So eager was he to recover his prize that he offered a $500 reward for his capture. He cautioned that his escaped charge presented a threat to both wildlife and pets. $500 being worth just under $17,200 in 2024. This is interesting because they aren't outright saying that this monster was the Jersey Devil. In any case, the stage had been set, and now all they needed was a monster. The book The Secret History of the Jersey Devil states that Jeffries hired a Ringling Brothers circus clown, George Hartzell, along with 15 to 20 rustabout buddies, or fellow circus performers, to dress up in farmers' clothes and act as monster hunters. The expedition armed themselves with, quote, nets, javelins, marlin spikes, and cobblestones? Anyway, and pitchforks, striking out with a good amount of loud public fanfare, drawing as much attention to themselves as possible. After disappearing into the forest, there were desperate shouts and gunshots. The screams of men, and possibly of a strange beast, were heard. A battered group of brave men emerged, pulling a covered cart with them. Supposedly, quote, the creature was finally subdued when one man with a net climbed the tree under which the devil was standing his ground. While the party pelted the vampire with snowballs, man, that's an image, the stalwart in the tree dropped the net. The next day, papers declared the creature had been caught. However, one of the papers reported a much less exciting capture. Quote, in this account, a box was opened and out meandered a harmless, quote, Jersey Devil, which started peacefully grazing on some brown grass where the snow had melted. The handlers fell upon the hapless animal and hauled it off for their exhibition. Yeah, I noticed that this account says that out meandered a harmless Jersey Devil, when this group was supposedly out to capture a vampire, like I said, jumbled and messy. Either way, the vampire monster thing could be seen at the 9th and Arch Street Dime Museum, for a small price, of course. It should be noted that in another source, the book The Jersey Devil, Hope supposedly got word that Jordan Hartzell of the 2500 block of Lee Street in Philadelphia had spotted the creature sprinting through the woods at the end of Allegheny Avenue. So according to this source, the hunting posse wasn't a group of disguised circus performers putting on an act of capturing a creature, but that they were an actual hunting posse of frightened and probably a little excited civilians. Whether this was a group of actors or a posse of farmers, it certainly changes the tone of the event itself, shifting it from an event of trickery to one of desperation and fear. In any case, the beast was captured, and the curious masses naturally arrived to see it. For 10 cents, which would be worth about $3.50 today, they could enter the curio hall with a large cage covered by a curtain. As the curtain was drawn back, the crowd would push forward, gasping at the bones strewn about the cage floor. The creature then leapt forward, the eager spectators now pushing back, shrieking in fear and surprise. Wings flapped in the shadowy cage, banging on the front bars, before the creature again backed into the darkness. Before the crowd could do anything except gape in shock, Jeffries would hurriedly usher them out so that he could reset for the next group of sightseers. Well, the Australian vampire isn't exactly famous today, so what was this monster really? Years later, Norman Jeffries would finally fess up to his role in this hoax. This monster was actually a kangaroo that they'd rented from the mysterious Professor Edwards up in Buffalo, New York. They painted green stripes on it, which the kangaroo licked off. They found a different paint that the kangaroo wasn't as interested in, but then the kangaroo demolished the first set of wings that they'd tried to fix onto its back. A new set was made from thin bronze and covered in rabbit fur, which also managed to stay on, at least for a while. When the crowds came in, the kangaroo wasn't exactly eager to put on a show, so they hid a small boy within the shadowy cage. The boy would use a long stick with a nail to prompt the poor animal to leap at the front of the cage. A blur of stripes, a long tail, a large body, wings flapping. And for a fleeting instant, a monster was in the cage. Rinse and repeat. Now, while this may have entertained children and the more naive spectators, to many, the jig was up. Journalists tripped over each other in their haste to point out that this hoax was proof that the entire week of January 1909 was one colossal hoax. When the show had run its course, the poor kangaroo was returned to Professor Edwards. But we haven't even mentioned possibly the biggest part of this hoax. Remember Jeffries explaining his plan to Bradenberg and Hopkins? According to the secret history of the Jersey Devil, the plan goes further back than the kangaroo scheme. Authors Brian Regal and Frank Esposito claim that Jeffries had noted the widespread obsession with the Leeds Devil and had therefore started to plant stories about the monster in the local press in 1908. The book goes on to say that the Jersey Devil picked up speed from these fictional articles, becoming a child of the media rather than genuine folklore. Supposedly, a newspaper editor approached Jeffries, knowing that the creature was a created fiction. He suggested that Jeffries should kill off the creature at this point, but Jeffries and Bradenberg wanted to make some money off of the creature one last time. The men decided to go the Fiji mermaid route. For those who don't know, the Fiji mermaid was a creature put on display by P.T. Barnum in 1842. This creature turned out to be the torso and head of a juvenile monkey that had been sewn together with the tail of a fish. This would not be the only Fiji mermaid created for financial gain, but the point, in reference to the Jersey Devil, was the same. The stories might be fake, but perhaps the body could be real, if only they could convince people that they'd actually captured it. And this was when the kangaroo plan was cooked up. It should be noted that I didn't find any other source that claimed that all, or even the majority, of the reports from 1908 until the week of 1909 were created by Jeffries. Oh, the kangaroo scam was definitely a real event. However, I'm unsure of the secret history of the Jersey Devil's first claim. Hysteria and hoaxes can account for a lot, but that's a lot of people that Jeffries had supposedly manipulated. I think it's a little dismissive to say that people read a few planted fictions in the newspaper and then hundreds of people manufactured sightings and experiences within the same week. Also, I can't help but think that Jeffries planting stories a full year before the big incident was a very long game plan for a type of business that needed money fast. So, I'm unsure, but these are all definitely things to consider. Despite all of this effort, and even though the museum earned a decent amount of money, this hoax turned out to be Brandenburg and Jeffries' swan song, and the museum finally closed. So those are the hoaxes attached specifically to the week of 1909, and now we'll continue to the hoaxes that took place after. Let's leap forward to 1925. A man named William Hyman of Greenwich Township claims that he's managed to kill the Jersey Devil. But there was one big problem with this. There's no record of a man by that name in the area. Shortly after that, the body of the Jersey Devil was found up a tree in Swedesboro, but nothing came of that report either. In 1925, the Woodbury Daily Times wrote about William Hymer of Greenwich Township in Gloucester County. Hymer apparently, quote, found a strange beast consuming his chickens. After a half-mile chase, he caught the devil, and the two engaged in a brawl. Hymer managed to shoot the culprit dead, and later proudly exhibited the carcass before the curious eyes of hundreds of visitors. He described it as being, quote, as big as a grown Airedale, with black fur resembling astrakhan, having a kangaroo-fashioned hop, 4 quarters higher than its rear, which were always crouched, and hind feet of 4 webbed toes. Its eyes are still open and very yellow, and its jaw is neither dog, wolf, nor coyote. Its crushers in the lower jaw each have 4 prongs into which the upper teeth fit perfectly. Pretty impressive, right? Well, when the Woodbury Daily Times tried to track down this man that they'd already written about, there was no record of any William Hymer. I don't know if they'd heard about this story, if someone had written in with this anecdote, or what, but yeah, a pretty embarrassing dead end. 1952. At Whitesbog, F.A. Fralinger found strange tracks deep in the Pine Barrens. He immediately notified the New Jersey State Police, who then sent in State Game Warden Wesley Gibbs to investigate. His conclusion was that the tracks were made with a bear's foot mounted on a pole. It turns out he was right on the money, as he later found the improvised Jersey Devil leg. Pushing forward to October 1957, foresters with the New Jersey Department of Conservation and Economic Development found burnt, eerie remains at the edge of a cranberry bog in an area of the Barrens called Hampton Furnace. I was expecting a fragment of bones or something else relatively insubstantial, especially after hours of reading about they heard this crazy account or found this crazy thing, and then nothing ever came of it. However, these remains included a partial skeleton, claws, feathers, and unidentified hind legs. Quote, opinion was divided as to whether these fragmentary remains were left as a prank, an old trophy, or were the dismembered body of the Jersey Devil. The largest reward ever offered for the Jersey Devil came in 1960 from Harry Hunt of the Hunt Brothers Circus in Florence. He was offering $100,000, which would be a staggering $1,043,000 in 2024. Well, he never had to pay up. The book The Phantom of the Pines reports that in the early 1960s, quote, laundry hung out to dry was found scattered about the yards, tools were inexplicably moved, cars mysteriously appeared up on curbs, and road signs were twisted awry. Residents were alarmed and thought it was the devil up to his old tricks once more. Eventually, however, the local police found out the incidents were not supernatural, but the work of local teenagers. 1964. Mary Catherine Kennedy recounted a fond, humorous memory of her father, William Felter. He picked an already sickly tree in the front yard, placing fake tracks around it. He then claimed that the dead tree was caused by the Jersey Devil, neglecting, of course, to mention that the tree was already terminally ill by natural means. Well, the neighborhood children were convinced, if no one else. The Jersey Devil became a way to haze incoming policemen to the Pinelands area. Rookie cops were warned to be extremely careful whenever they were sent to remote areas, to keep an eye out for the Jersey Devil. Many rookies would scoff, but they'd still nervously keep their car's lights on when on those calls. Quote, "His car burned out far more than its share of dome light bulbs." In May of 1976, New Jersey State Forest Ranger Clyde Birdsall from Sweetwater arrived at the Aston Ranger Station and leapt back, more than a little startled to encounter an 8-foot-tall Jersey Devil in the front door. But it wasn't moving. Upon closer inspection, he realized that this devil was made of papier-mâché, wood, and chicken wire. However, these pranksters were even more dedicated than that, as they'd given their creation literal flashing lights for eyes. In the May of 1978, Lenape native Bill Thompson, his indigenous name being Listens to Whippoorwill, and 2 companions hatched a prank for the campers along the Wading River at Bodine Field in Wharton State Forest. They strolled along the camps, picked a bonfire to sit at, and entertained the campers with eerie stories of the Jersey Devil, including the odd detail that it could walk on water. These seeds now planted, the campers went to bed. The 3 friends crept into the woods and began raising hell. As his companions continued howling, Thompson quickly paddled a canoe out onto the water, whacking noisily at the surface. He then held a flashlight pointed upward into his face, slumping over the canoe, giving him the appearance of an attacked boatman. By the time the campers disentangled themselves from their tents and hustled to the river, they were thoroughly terrified. One girl even leapt across the campfire in her desperation to escape the monster hiding in the woods. A group of campers in Smithville were rehearsing the reenactment of military battles of the area. One night, the Jersey Devil was rampaging into and out of the tents, creating a Scooby-Doo chase into and out of the fabrics. Eventually, it was discovered that one of the campers had packed a Jersey Devil costume and used the opportunity to terrorize his friends. Interestingly, this same group would reenact the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Chestnut Neck in the October of 1978. During this event, mysterious screaming was heard in the woods, but no prankster was ever discovered. It's finally time to talk about how this entire creature and the events that followed came to be. Our first section has to do with demons, witches, and the devil himself. Let's get more specific in terms of evil in the world, specifically to the early European settlers. You see, to them, demons and witches weren't costumes or just stories. They were real. Let's try to put ourselves into that mindset. What if, all of a sudden, half of your crops died right before harvesting for winter? You and your family labored over that food. It was painful, back-breaking work, blisters popping on your skin as you do this repeated, agonizing task. In a time of limited options and resources, this was all that you could do in order to provide security to your probably numerous children. In the end, you've done nothing wrong that anyone can tell. To you, you've done everything that you were familiar with to provide a good harvest. But what if it was possible? that maybe you'd slipped up and said something mildly inconsiderate to your neighbor. And what if it was possible that with a few words or with an evil ritual, that neighbor was able to doom your entire family? She wouldn't have even had to come out and personally sow salt into your fields or hack the crops to pieces. It just took a few words. Back at this time, not everyone could read or write, that only being a skill commonly learned by white men. Even if you did know how to read, which the Puritans in particular valued, there was usually only one thing available: religious texts, in particular the Bible. With such limited access, people weren't really reading anything that would challenge their beliefs or provide new information. Almost all of the information they had in order to survive came from the church, or was passed on from their family, who, more likely than not, also based their lives on the church's authority. And I'm not here to say that religious communities were a 100% bad thing. The people that came together under the roof of a church was sometimes all that a community had to support each other and survive in a harsh new world. However, with so much reliance on the church and the religious community, if the church told you not to read or to listen to a reading of a paper, book, or pamphlet that challenged the church's beliefs, you wouldn't. You live in one enormous echo chamber with nowhere to go but into the woods, which your religious authority told you contains demons and devils and witches. In May 1668, the General Assembly in East Jersey passed a law that said, quote, "If any person be found to be a witch, either male or female, they shall be put to death." Here's a specific example of what would happen if you lived within a community, but you didn't perfectly fall in line. Anne Hutchinson lived in Boston, amongst the ruling Puritan elites of the 1630s and 1640s. Hutchinson questioned the authority that members of the clergy class held, as these clergy members claimed that they were messengers between an individual and God. Predictably, the Puritan authorities didn't like a woman cutting them out of the relationship between an individual and God, removing their ability to manipulate said individuals. At first, they made her a pariah, but that was only the beginning. She was arrested, tried for heresy, and banished from Boston. She and a number of followers moved to the slightly more tolerant city of Providence, Rhode Island. As the story goes, Hutchinson became pregnant for the 16th time, giving birth to, quote, "a disturbing mass that bore little resemblance to a child." Just before this, one of her young protégés, Mary Dyer, had also given birth to a deformed child. This was perfect ammunition to prove that Hutchinson's beliefs must truly be evil, as she and her follower had birthed the punishment for their heretic ways. The coincidence of both Hutchinson and Dyer supposedly giving birth to deformed children almost at the same time makes me question if any part of those events are actually true. It would serve the church to make up details, or the events altogether, to try to break any sympathy that may have been had for the women. Mary Dyer would later go on to be executed in 1660 by the Puritans because, amongst other things, she committed the crime of converting to Quakerism. Again, this story fit right into the church's purposes. It proved that these women had suffered the wrath of God because they had dared to be independent, have a will of their own at all, and resisted the church's domination. As far as the church was concerned, Hutchinson had earned her monstrous birth, and, quote, that she had given birth to a monster was just one more reason to consider her a heretic, in need of cleansing from the community. These monstrous birth stories, instead of being a tragedy that deserved compassion, were used to scare the church's parishioners back into proper behavior. God's will is passed through us to you, and this is what will happen to you if you don't do what we say God commands. Hutchinson's death was also earned, according to the church. She was tragically killed by indigenous people in Connecticut, a retaliation for their own persecution by the Christians of the area, Instead of recognizing this as a terrible cycle that should be broken, this tragedy was simply another way that Hutchinson got what she deserved, as well as proving that the natives were indeed the savages that the settlers feared them to be. So essentially, the Jersey Devil may have begun from a very real, tragic birth by a woman who crossed the church. The church then possibly twisted this sad event into an example of the demons out in the woods, and the necessity of remaining close to the church, God. Another theory is one that we've all heard before: cults. One report in particular reports that, quote, incidents of devil worship in the Pine Barrens have increased in the last dozen years. In the book Phantom of the Pines, it's explained that the presence of the Jersey Devil may be summoning people from nearby cities, who then participate in strange rituals. Quote, over the years, many Jerseyites have reported witnessing groups dressed in long robes, engaged in some sort of ceremony around a ritual fire deep in the woods. However, there seems to be a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Was the Jersey Devil there first, its presence attracting cultist activity, or were the cultist rituals responsible for summoning the Jersey Devil in the first place? Who can say? Cults just seem to be a reliable theory to fall back on for most odd mysteries. One conclusion can be reasonably drawn. See, the Jersey Devil has been used as a representation of the presence of Satan in the world. The Jersey Devil may be a child of the devil, or it might not be. Either way, from a religious standpoint, the Jersey Devil's mere existence proves that evil exists. While it seems rare for Satan to show himself, the Jersey Devil has a ton of sightings, and more importantly, we know where it lives. Instead of a nebulous hell where the devil lives, we know the area and zip code for where the Jersey Devil enacts its mischief. This has given the residents of the area a consistent scapegoat for any number of misfortunes. We saw how this scapegoat behavior was used by the church or the men in power to portray women, or witches, as a target to blame. So we take this scapegoat concept and instead pin it directly to the creature itself. Because bad things happen. Crops die, milk goes bad, nasty weather rolls through town, it's just a fact of life. But similar to the Lake Lanier episode, or honestly any number of our episodes, the monster provides a cause for the worst of these events. Not only that, but it birthed a kind of hope that evil could be killed. To give evil a body of flesh and blood, living in a specific area, it gives a very rare possibility that maybe someone with good aim and good luck could actually kill evil. In an area where its people were clinging on by their fingernails every single day, this kind of hope was priceless. Quote, deep in their minds, the many posses that pursued him throughout Jersey history must have cherished the thought that the world would be infinitely easier to live in if they could successfully confine or kill the devil. After all, opportunities to slay evil do not arise that often. However, we must also remember that the opposite is also true, that by claiming that there was a monster just beyond the campfire, this gave power to the religious and political leaders. It reinforced their ability to coerce people to obey and respect their authority by offering the leadership and power to protect their citizens from the embodiment of evil. The next potential origin comes from a horrifying trend in European society: monstrous births. Frank Esposito and Brian Regal explain, quote, monstrous births, such as babies with two heads, multiple arms and legs, or no arms or legs, both fascinated and repulsed Europeans, and became the source for considerable and popular printed literature. Pamphlets and broadsides on monstrous births, often accompanied by lurid illustrations, alternately accurate or outrageously fantastic, sold well, particularly in England, whence many early settlers of New Jersey hailed. Along with depicting actual births of deformed animals and humans, monster pamphlets used such cases as excuses to attack political or religious groups. Attaching a monster to a religious denomination, an individual, or a family proved an effective way to bring social ridicule upon the target. We already saw an example of attaching the birth of a monster to a specific person in order to discredit them, and there's a lot more where that came from. But now we're going to take a completely different turn. Instead of a fictional story of a monster child, perhaps the child was real. But maybe that child had conditions that people of the time would view as monstrous. Or maybe by simply hiding the child away, the rumors that surrounded that child were what made it into a monster. After all, human beings make it their business to create stories about things that they don't understand, or to draw conclusions about situations with incomplete information. Reverend Henry Beck was told about the hidden child of Mrs. Shorts, the mother of the Jersey Devil in this telling. His book from the summer of 1947 reads, quote, "And devil it was, at least to the villagers who were never permitted to see the being, probably a malformed child, that joined the family. All Mrs. Shorts had to do was pull down the shades, close the shutters, and keep the child out of sight. The villagers did the rest." The book Absagami Yesteryear specifically writes the deformed child theory into the origin story itself. The general story is the same, all the way through the birth of the 13th child. Instead of wings and hooves, the child was, for lack of better words, more naturally deformed. Mother Leeds kept this perceived abomination locked in the attic or cellar. When she became too sick to care for her final offspring, the starving prisoner broke out and never returned. Was he actually loved and hidden for his own protection? Or was he an embarrassment that no one would acknowledge? Who knows? But the story certainly writes from the perspective of a bitter wild child, now living in the surrounding swamps and living off of rats from the barns and fields of local farms. According to this version, people would catch glimpses of something they couldn't really explain, and any attempt to pin down this unsettling figure was unsuccessful. And we shouldn't forget that people of this time believed that deformities were the result of God's wrath, the payment for some evil that the family must have done. This would be challenged in the 17th century by Francis Bacon. Quote, "He argued that scholars should engage with the type of monsters and biological wonders the curiosity collectors focused on." Despite this encouragement to study anomalies, his stance was that, quote, "superstition should be avoided, as should, quote, natural magic and alchemy." It was a very practical viewpoint. Italian Fortunio Licetti, also in the early 1600s, had a doctorate in philosophy and a medical degree, studying biological distortion in its early stages. Quote, "He tried to explain deformities through hereditary causes rather than divine or demonic ones. Deformities and monsters appeared, he argued, as a result of nature trying to work its way around some natural biological impediment. He did not think deformities were curses from God or errors by nature, but were instead nature's attempt to adapt." Despite these more progressive theories, it wouldn't be for many years that communities would even consider shifting their religious viewpoints. Families had almost no choice but to hide the child away from the aggressive attitudes of the times, either to shield the child for its own safety or to shield themselves from public shame. Now recall that one of the most popular theories about the Jersey Devil is that it's a harbinger of doom, or more specifically, war. 1914. The devil's seen in the Pine Barrens right before the outbreak of World War I. 1937. The devil's spotted swooping over the pines and dunes, just shy of Italy invading Ethiopia. December 7th, 1941. Villagers of Mount Holly, New Jersey, see the creature over their town, seeming to eerily predict the planes that would shortly be descending upon Pearl Harbor that very same day. The Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, all the same story. But it isn't just wars. Oh no. As animals flee before a tsunami or earthquake, so too does the Jersey Devil stir from its den. It seems to react the most to severe coastal storms and major forest fires. And every now and then, he seems to have a kind of precognition for tragedies, such as when it was spotted in May of 1937, just before the infamous Hindenburg crash. Quote, some people speculate that these appearances before wars or disasters are the Jersey Devil's way of warning that the events are impending, but others take a negative view of the devil and are convinced that he shows up to enjoy himself by watching people suffer. I don't find this connection to tragedy to be surprising. Since time immemorial, humans have sought the ability to foresee danger, to maybe even be able to prevent it. Although the last quote says that some believe the Jersey Devil enjoys suffering, there are far more quotes from locals over the years that see the Jersey Devil in a more outlaw or anti-hero kind of light. Even if the people seeing the devil flying over the trees didn't know exactly what was going to happen in Pearl Harbor or in Europe, I wonder if people saw this strange, supernatural creature as caring enough to warn people of what it knew, that maybe this hideous guardian angel was still a dedicated guardian nonetheless. Where our last theory was more about what people think the Jersey Devil's purpose is, or what its behavior means, this is more about what animal the Jersey Devil might be. Much like how sea monsters were drawn at the edges of nautical maps, the same applied to the American wilderness. Not only was the land new to settlers, but the animals contained within it were strange as well. While wolves were a fairly common problem in certain areas of Europe, bears weren't as frequently encountered in the UK. For example, let's talk about cougars. Can you imagine how terrifying the screams of a mountain lion at night would be to a community that had never encountered one before? If you haven't done this before, go look up what a mountain lion's scream sounds like. Yeah, that sound would definitely contribute to the fear of demons in the woods. And then there's the cat itself. All of a sudden, their understanding of a house cat was multiplied to be larger than even their biggest hunting dogs. Even some of the smaller animals were viewed with suspicion. Imagine never growing up with the knowledge of raccoons and how weird encountering one would be. As a side note, there are raccoons in Europe now, but that wasn't until they were released there in the 1930s as a source of fur. When local natural history societies and museums began to spring up to capitalize on this fascination with the local flora and fauna, the exhibits were deemed so bizarre that many visitors didn't believe that these animals actually existed. Which also gives us an idea of how so many taxidermied fakes were accepted as genuine. Everything seemed equally unbelievable. For instance, Thomas Jefferson sent a stuffed moose to Paris and was met with immediate and overwhelming skepticism. A quote from Esposito and Regal reads, quote, so rampant was the belief in monsters in America that a dragon-like horse or deer born of a human mother did not pose difficulties. It didn't even really stick out. Along with the monsters created in the nation's psyche, the discovery of flesh and blood monsters provided more than enough physical evidence of their existence. With all of this in mind, the suggestions about the Jersey Devil's true identity began to roll in. An expert working with the Smithsonian Institution thought that the Jersey Devil could be a pterodactyl that was now living in underground caves. Professor Breitkopf of the School of Science in Philadelphia scoffed that clearly the tracks were made by the Peleosaurus catellia of the Jurassic period. Quote, these beasts had survived in limestone caves, which had sunk beneath the Gulf Stream. With trapped air, fresh water, and food, the life cycle continued. Recent volcanic activity allowed them to escape their underground home and swim to the shores of South Jersey. Breitkopf described Peleosaurus as being 20 feet tall. They walked on their hind legs and used the membrane on their legs for flying. The professor advised that, quote, no fear need to be had of these beasts, and anyone finding one, pen him up and feed him milk and fish. And just like that, you could have a pet prehistoric beast and the Jersey Devil all wrapped into one. The suggestion of a crossbreed hybrid was tossed around. Quite a few theorized that the Jersey Devil could be the missing link. Mrs. Cassidy of Clayton, New Jersey, declared that the footprints were from an invasion of screwfoot ducks. Apparently, there were a few times that a colony of these ducks, leaving tracks on new snow, had triggered an already jumpy community. During one of these such incidences, a hunting posse assembled at the edge of the woods, daring not to enter. Instead, they called into the woods, quote, "If you are the devil, rattle your chains." Which is one of the baddest things I've ever heard on a monster hunt, even if it was directed at some ducks. Another animal from the natural world that's been suggested is the hammerhead bat. Now, while the bat is enormous, its wingspan is only 3 feet. I say only in the scope of how large the Jersey Devil's wingspan is described. But go look up what the bat looks like. Take a look at its head in particular. Yeah, that could explain some sightings. They do also have an incredibly loud call. But hammerhead bats don't live in America. They're in Africa. Wait a minute, don't toss this theory just yet. There may have been a way that at least a few could have made their way to America. There was a shipping lane that traveled up the Mullica River from the 1600s to the 1800s. Sometimes animals would stow away on ships, and while most of the time we think of rats, snakes, and the occasional monkey, sometimes bats stowed away too. A shipping galley would travel to New Jersey from Africa, these bats perhaps traveling with them, getting loose once the boats reached port. However, these bats wouldn't be used to the harsh New Jersey winter, and the visitors probably passed away with the changing of the seasons. While some theorize that these bats may have adapted to the cold, I think it's far more likely that they did die out once winter hit. This would also create limited sightings of the animal, as well as almost no opportunity to find and study them. The major obvious flaw is that while this may account for fleeting sightings, it wouldn't cover the face-to-face sightings. Also, something to consider is that many of the sightings we've described took place in the winter, by which time the bats wouldn't exactly be around, so that's another issue. However, on the show Expedition X, co-host Phil Torres suggests that this might be a case of insular gigantism. When an animal is isolated to one area away from other variants, it can sometimes grow exponentially, like the giant Galapagos tortoises. Despite this suggestion of how a natural animal could become a monster in size, it still doesn't account for their survival in such a drastic environmental change from what they were used to. While there are some Jersey Devil noises that remain unidentified, quite a few locals are able to recognize audible traits described to them. Woodcarver Gary Giberson, who's part of a family that's lived in the area for 14 generations, believes the sounds are from a red fox. Daniel Leeds Matthews Jr. and William Kuntz believe the noises are from owls. Early Danley thinks the distressed screams could be from a trapped animal, like a rabbit. Ed Herbert states that packs of wild dogs occasionally roam the Pine Barrens, and their mischief could be mistakenly attributed to the Jersey Devil, be it noises, destruction of crops, or the death of farm animals. So when it comes to noises, we definitely have some contenders. There's one animal that comes up again and again when discussing the Jersey Devil. This bird did its best to avoid the European settlers stomping through the forests and marshes, but if it couldn't immediately escape, it met these intruders with incredible violence. This bird was so feared by the settlers that rumor had it that it could drive its bill straight through a man's eye and into his brain. Quote, "The sandhill crane weighs about 12 pounds and is about 4 feet long, with a titanic wingspread of 80 inches. That's a wingspan of over 6.5 feet. Not only is it bigger than almost anything that the Europeans were used to dealing with, but its voice manifests as a whooping call, which is audible up to 2.5 miles away. Large numbers of the cranes engage in a dancing mating ritual, hopping long distances. Now, if you're a settler already prepared to see groups of witches dancing naked for Satan in the woods, how do you think they viewed this screaming, hopping, whooping mating dance? The birds weren't exactly harmless in the general sense either. While they didn't like to encounter the groups of newcomers, they did greatly appreciate that the strangers thoughtfully gathered corn, potatoes, and eggs that the sandhill crane would delightedly steal from farmers. While definitely a contender, there are a number of features that don't line up with most reports of the Jersey Devil. The horse, dog, or donkey head is notably missing, as well as any long tail to speak of. The wings of the Jersey Devil are most often described as being the wings of a bat. I do think that the sandhill crane is probably responsible for a large number of sightings, particularly when the sightings consist of a large silhouette swooping over the trees, or when the sounds of a strange monster are heard, but no animal is witnessed. But I don't know how much I can insist that all of the sightings are of a bird, especially when a person is face to face with a chimera-like monster. And then we again have the issue of a good number of the sightings, specifically those from the week of 1909, were in the winter when the sandhill crane would have already migrated. So we again have a possible culprit that only checks some of the boxes. Now we're going from a potential flesh and blood culprit to a monster warped by the mind. The most common of these, as well as being a favorite for anything unexplained, mass hysteria. Healthline defines mass hysteria, also known as mass psychogenic illness, to a collective anxiety that builds off of the anxieties of one's peers, culminating into a series of symptoms. These symptoms can include hallucinations, physical behaviors, or beliefs. I want to be clear that mass hysteria isn't so simple as to be called panic. Mass hysteria is a conversion disorder, a mental health condition where physical symptoms develop in response to immense emotional or mental stress. While conversion disorder is most common in individuals, mass hysteria, or MPI, is conversion on a massive scale, each victim further building up the condition in one another. In my own studies of this phenomena, it seems to be most common within tightly knit groups, be it those who live within the same physical area or a group that shares a very strong belief system. This can make it difficult for an outsider to break through the group's perceptions and introduce new information, or to calm the situation down. While mass hysteria does exist, I'm cautious to use it as a quick answer when it comes to strange phenomena. Quite a few people will just toss out the words mass hysteria in order to ignore large numbers of experiences, which I find to be unscientific and dismissive. So while we shouldn't assume that mass hysteria isn't at least partially responsible, I highly doubt that it's the only culprit. But some people really water down the cause of the Jersey Devil. One of the most basic theories is that people made it up because they were just bored. Life in the Pine Barrens wasn't easy. Time moved slowly, and sure, a crazy monster in the woods certainly added an air of mystery and excitement. Where people in the cities might have had other sources of entertainment, the Pine Barrens formed posses to chase a cryptid through the woods. The 1976 book The Jersey Devil reads, quote, "To some of those who joined the many posses, an important motive was, no doubt, the chance to find adventure in their own backyard." Some theorists were less tactful. Geologist W.S. Reed of Haddonfield concluded that the Jersey Devil was merely an effect of, quote, "the mild but general idiocy on the part of the public." In particular, he believed the mysterious footprints to be nothing more than human footprints affected by the elements. Long story short, he believed that footprints left in soft, dry snow could be crystallized by rain. Then the freezing process would cause the frozen snow to expand. This would make the footprints appear much smaller than they were when they were first pressed into the snow. Whether this theory is true or not, it doesn't explain the inaccessible locations where a good number of prints were found. Our last short theory is an interesting one posed by writers Lauren Coleman and Ivan T. Sanderson, that maybe the entire monster was an elaborate real estate hoax. If those wanting to collect the land just spread stories of a monster in the woods, and maybe even planted some physical evidence, then it stands to reason that people wouldn't exactly be lining up around the block to purchase the properties. This would lower the prices of said properties, leaving them perfectly primed for developers to swoop in and take advantage of the bottom-of-the-barrel prices. Sanderson even found a set of fake feet used to create false prints. Coleman himself wrote in his book Cryptozoology A to Z, quote, "Hoofprints and other evidence were faked or misidentified. The stories of sightings seem to have been a combination of planted stories, hoaxes, and imagination fueled by fear." Now we come to two of the most compelling and interesting theories. But first, we're going to need to lay some historical groundwork. In the 1650s, the Quakers fled Puritan persecution in England. At first, they ended up in Massachusetts, only to find more Puritan persecution. But what was it exactly that the Puritans hated so much about the Quakers? One of the biggest causes of conflict was that the Quakers didn't believe a priest or clergyman was necessary to act as a go-between from God to man. The Quakers believed that the relationship between God and man was, well, just that, a relationship between only God and only man. Most religious communities outright hated this viewpoint, as we saw with Anne Hutchinson, as it took all power from the religious leaders and placed it back with the people. With religious leadership maintaining a death grip on its communities, you can see why a group rejecting that religious leadership would immediately threaten the powers that be. The Quakers also supported the ever-forbidden quest of women's equality, as well as promoting the rights of indigenous people, and they rejected the need for worldly possessions. So let's review. The Quakers actively preached that the religious leadership wasn't necessary to have a healthy relationship with God. They supported people who weren't white men and encouraged people to not have to rely on physical possessions. All of these things would diminish the need for the men in power, and you know what they say about 3 strikes and all that. Unfortunately for the Quakers, the Puritans had already established a strong foothold in the New World. The Puritan government in Boston quickly passed anti-Quaker laws, which included fines and bodily maimings as punishments. Some of the first Quakers to arrive were imprisoned. Some were executed. Quote, "The Puritans quickly took control of local politics and religion, persecuting whomever they pleased." The Quakers fled to West Jersey and managed to make their own community. They weren't alone for long, though, as Catholics and Anglicans followed. However, these groups managed to maintain a decent peace with each other. When settlers were starting to poke around the Jersey area, the Pine Barrens had a major advantage. The Delaware River opened directly to the Atlantic Ocean, making it easy to sail large ships into the mainland. This made the nearby area perfect for shipping lanes. The Dutch and Swedish settlers were also met with little resistance from the indigenous people. Gabriel Thomas noted that the natives had pleasant dispositions and were fairly peaceful. Despite the positive first encounters and the general view of the indigenous peoples that the Quakers practiced, the intolerant perspective of the new settlers soon leaned towards what we're much more familiar with. We start to see this manifest in 1633, when John DeLaet's New World was published in Europe. He wrote that the Indians of the New World, quote, "have no worship of God. They indeed pay homage to the devil, but not so solemnly nor with such precise ceremonies as the Africans do." This is a very familiar perception that we discussed at length in the Wendigo episode, that these newcomers viewed the indigenous peoples strictly through a Christian lens, which wasn't relevant or helpful when it came to understanding or communicating with the native peoples. As well, having this published in Europe was biasing the Europeans' perception of the indigenous peoples before they even set foot in the New World. Quote, this inaccurate description enabled the early non-Quaker colonists to justify their commercial exploitation of the Indians and, in the time of conflict, to kill them. In New Netherlands, Wilhelm Kieft, the Dutch colonial governor, even provided that a bounty be paid for the scalps of the Raritan Lenape Indians. Let's talk about the Lenape people themselves. The Lenape were friendly with the Quakers, coinciding well with the Quakers' more tolerant beliefs and respect for the indigenous people. This more positive arrangement meant more frequent and peaceful interactions between them. More frequent interactions meant more opportunity for each group to unintentionally influence each other. Remember, the settlers viewed these new forests with caution, the local animals with fear. Everywhere they turned gave the impression of looming danger. In such a delicate and paranoid state, it wasn't hard for them to take in other influences that further reinforced these feelings. The idea that the Lenape people didn't have a deity for the devil or Satan greatly alarmed most of the European colonists. If they didn't know about the devil, then how could they protect themselves from him? And hell, if they didn't know about God, well then clearly this was a mission from God to bring these poor heathens into the fold. Many colonists thought they were saving the natives, when in reality, they were obliterating who they were and their way of life. But that's a story for another time. In any case, the Lenape people might not have had the devil or the Christian God, but they did, and do, believe that there are both good and bad spirits in the world. For example, the Lenape cut holes in the soles of a baby's moccasins to let evil spirits escape the body of the infant through the feet. Even in the mid-20th century, Lenape children, who'd since been pushed out to Oklahoma, were told not to whistle at night for fear of attracting evil spirits. Like many cultures, they paid homage to the good spirits via prayer and ceremonies in an attempt to maintain the balance between the positive and the negative. They just didn't believe that evil manifested behind one being. In the 1650s, a Swedish architect named Peter Lindström wrote about the Lenape's reaction to lightning. Quote, "The savages are so frightened that they hide themselves, for they know that the evil one exists, who can send them that which is evil." Far from fear of the devil, an incident like this actually shows the Lenape people's respect for their gods, such as Kish-ele Mukong. There's no way that the settlers weren't influenced by indigenous stories and beliefs. Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman point out that the legends of the Jersey Devil popped up around 1735, when interactions between colonists and natives were more frequent. But let's take a look at what may have influenced the colonists the most. The Lenape had their own stories of strange beasts in the woods. The Lenape called the Pine Barrens area Po Puesing, which translates to the place of the dragon. While I'm unsure why they called the area by this name, pterosaur fossils have been found in the area, and this prehistoric animal did have an elongated snout, wings, and a long tail. The Lenape also had, and have, a forest god known as Muchsing. The book Phantom of the Pines describes this deity as a sky god who functions as a protector of crops, wildlife, and children. But the Secret History of the Jersey Devil describes this deity as a deer-like creature with leathery wings, or a deer being ridden by a man. Both of these descriptions sounded a bit lacking to me. So I went and found the Project Gutenberg eBook of Religion and Ceremonies of the Lenape by M.R. Harrington. Harrington's book writes that Muchsing is the mask being, the living mask. Quote, "This being was made guardian by the creator of all the wild animals of the forest, and is sometimes seen riding on the back of a buck, herding the deer. But he lives in a range of rocky mountains above the earth. His face is large and round, the right half being painted red, the left black, while his body is covered with long dark hair like that of a bear." McCloy writes about an annual spring ceremony that the Lenape practiced, directing the ceremony towards Muchsing to ensure successful spring crops. The ceremony consisted of a person dressed as Muchsing, jumping over dancers and a fire. The Lenape represent him with a huge wooden mask, painted half red and half black. The mask is paired with a coat and a set of bearskin leggings, representing the being's hairy body. This costume is accessorized with a turtle shell, a stick, and a bearskin bag. This next account is from a traveler who witnessed one of these much-sing ceremonies. Quote, "After the dance is underway, the much-sing comes from the darkness, jumps over the dancers, and dances between the other dancers and the fire. He makes some funny and queer gestures, kicks the fire, and then departs. The much-sing is never allowed to talk. He never thinks of climbing a fence, but jumps over it every time that one is in the way. The devil dance is what the white men call it, but the Delawares call it the much-sing, or solid face dance. The much-sing does not represent an evil spirit, but is always considered a peacemaker. I suppose that it is from his hideous appearance that white men call him the devil." The traveler was closer to the truth than he realized, as this ceremony came to be known as the devil dance by the colonists. So we're seeing a lot of common ground between the Jersey Devil and much-sing, a deer-like creature with leathery wings, or a deer with a human rider, fuzzy bear legs. Essentially, the mix and match of animal parts. If we view the spring ceremony through a settler's eyes, the leaping, shadowy form of a masked, furry creature definitely creates some inspiration. Much-sing and the Jersey Devil were also associated with storms and calamities. Much-sing was also used as a kind of boogeyman for children, used to threaten them if they misbehaved. Quote, "If you don't behave, much-sing will carry you off in a bag full of snakes." Throw all of this together, along with the mental status of the colonists at the time, and it's not a big stretch to see how this indigenous deity could be confirming the colonists' worst beliefs about monsters in the woods. Possibly, the Jersey Devil could be the result of much-sing being viewed through a Christian lens. I wouldn't put it past the religious authorities at the time to use this indigenous-turned-Christian monster, scaring the religious settlers into obedience. Careful, it turns out there are monsters in the woods, monsters we've never even seen before, so it's best to stay close, keep your head down, and heed everything we say. The Lenape shared common ground with the Europeans in that they also believe in witches, complete with conjuring spells, flight, and the ability to travel great distances. The Lenape called them Gimojana, or Nightwalker. Interestingly, these Nightwalkers are humans inhabiting the bodies of evil creatures, instead of the other way around. Little pieces of this belief can be found in a smattering of Lenape daily life and practices. In the 20th century, the Lenape practiced chinking. They would use moss and clay to fill cracks in the spaces between logs to build their homes. Anthropologist Frank Speake, who worked extensively with the Lenape Delaware in Oklahoma, explains that this was done to prevent witches from slipping into their homes. This belief in witches from the indigenous peoples would have further confirmed the colonists' own obsession with witches and monsters in the woods. Both the colonial and indigenous versions of witches were already incredibly similar, and much-sing more than satisfied the proof that there were unknown entities in the woods. But the book Phantom of the Pines marries these even further in a third way. In the late 1970s, Doug Norcross wrote, quote, "The Jersey Devil is a direct descendant of an old Lenape Indian that put a curse upon his wife because she allows a white man to sleep with her. She got pregnant, and the son was the original Jersey Devil. The current devil is his great-great-great, something like that, grandson of that illegitimate child." We'll wrap up the indigenous peoples theory with one final interpretation that's certainly worth noting. Esposito and Regal write, quote, "Along with being a commentary on colonial American life, the Jersey Devil myth is a window into the treatment of the indigenous Lenape people. Once filled with native legends of forest dragons, the Pine Barrens had its supernatural inhabitants reduced to a single Anglo-American entity. Not only are the Lenape people of the region ousted from their lands, so are their spirits and monsters. The Jersey Devil's transformation is also an ethnic one. It's Lenape heritage, filtered out and forgotten. Today's legend, as told, has no native elements. It occurs wholly outside the native experience, as if that had never existed, despite its connections. Our most detailed theory is one that's as fascinating as it is compelling: the story and conflicts of Daniel Leeds. Daniel Leeds. We've only discussed Mother Leeds so far, only barely even mentioning a Mr. Leeds. Believe it or not, Mr. Leeds was real, but what about his monstrous child? November 1652. Daniel Leeds is likely born in Leeds, England, to an Anglican family, which also includes two brothers, William and Thomas. 1658, Daniel Leeds is 7 when his family joined the Society of Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers. The Quaker Act of 1662 demanded that every Quaker must swear an oath of allegiance to the king, exactly the kind of demand that the Quakers wouldn't agree to. Furious with this failed attempt at absolute control, the monarchy doubled down on its efforts to squash this rebellious group. The Conventicle Act of 1664 made it illegal for 5 Quakers to gather together, preventing meetings or community worship. If you disobeyed this law, the first offense meant a fine of £5. The second offense resulted in a fine of £10. The third offense would see you into forced immigration to, quote, far-off lands. Well, Thomas Leeds, Daniel's father, wasn't exactly one to bow his head. In 1666, he invited 20 of his Quaker friends to his home. Authorities rounded them up, convicting them of meeting illegally. Shifting to his son, and our main focus, Daniel Leeds, in 1671, 20-year-old Daniel had a vision that, quote, reinvigorated his views on religion. This would be one of a handful of visions that he'd experienced throughout his life. He would go on long walks, weeping alone as he constantly worried over the future of his soul. In 1672, Daniel's father Thomas was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The stress of his family being harassed, his father incarcerated, and the concerns of his own immortal soul were starting to take a toll on Daniel. In the midst of this mess, Jesus appeared to Daniel, showing him a vision of the spirit world. Excited, he sought guidance from the local Anglican ministers, but they dismissed his experiences. The Quakers, on the other hand, welcomed him, his eccentricities, and experiences with open arms. While this sense of community definitely helped Daniel, the Leeds family at large decided that the crushing weight of the monarchy and religious persecution was too heavy to bear, so they'd try their luck elsewhere. The Leedses all got ready for departure except for Mary Leeds, who would stay and die of smallpox in 1677. The family made their way to the New World, settling in Shrewsbury, Monmouth County, on 240 acres of land. Eventually, the family's sons would spread out, making their home in Burlington amongst the Quaker population. The Quakers signed a document in 1677 that, quote, stressed freedom of religion, an elected assembly, no taxation without representation, and the rights of the native people. The Society of Friends purchased land from the Lenape people and started to build a settlement. Now, Daniel Leeds married his first wife in England, but she would pass away. He married his second wife in 1681, but she died on December 3rd while giving birth to their daughter Anne, who tragically passed away soon after. His third marriage to Dorothy Young would give him 8 children, but his wife would pass away in 1699. Daniel Leeds married his fourth and final wife, Jane Revel. Some variants of the Jersey Devil story say that Mother Leeds' name was Jane, but history doesn't note if she actually had any children with Daniel. Anyway, Daniel Leeds eventually strengthened his place in the community by becoming a survey general. What's important about this job is that it gave Daniel a lot of influence. Property lines were only just starting to be laid down, the land ownership giving power and authority to the families that owned the land. Daniel's profession included the ability to settle property disputes and establish boundaries, and this gave him power. But it also probably earned him a few enemies. But some of the property lines that he established are still used today, one of them eventually becoming Leeds Point. Even within this relatively flexible Quaker society, Daniel Leeds was already getting some unfavorable attention. Being a survey general wasn't enough for Daniel. He believed that science, astrology, and mathematics were needed to better understand the universe, and therefore God's work within that universe. He was determined to share this combination of scripture and science with others. In 1686, Leeds started to write an almanac with these ideas, including astronomical calculations such as tracking the rising and setting of the moon and sun, as well as movements of other celestial bodies. Astrology was all the rage in England at the time. Almanacs were quite popular, and writing one would accomplish more than sharing Daniel's ideas. This would spread his name and influence, sure, but it would also carry helpful information to neighbors and, quote, help him contribute to the intellectual growth of his community. So in 1687, printer and Quaker William Bradford helped Daniel publish his first almanac in New Jersey. Daniel is super proud of this almanac. He thinks people are going to be blown away by this book, that he'd become someone to admire and look up to in the community. Well, Daniel certainly wasn't using the stars to do any fortune-telling. Despite the Quakers being more lenient than most religious groups, they were still a Christian branch that wanted to maintain control of their people. The Quaker elders read the almanac, claiming that this study of the movements of celestial bodies was far too close to pagan for their liking. Members complained that Leeds made connections between star signs and human body parts, using Greco-Roman heathen gods' names for planets. After all, Daniel Leeds was one of the first people in the Atlantic states to support that the Earth rotates around the sun, instead of the other way around. As a side note, religious authorities outright rejected this, because it would mean that the universe didn't rotate around us, God's children created in his image. I want to make it clear that Daniel Leeds was not referencing magic or any kind of witchy practices. But I suppose I can understand how many of these ideas may have spooked people. So they hated it. What happened next? What else do authoritarian groups do when they encounter books they don't like? They burn them. And so they tracked down every copy of Daniel's almanac they could get their hands on and destroyed them all. Today, you could count on one hand how many copies still exist. Destroying his work wasn't enough, though. They demanded that since he had, quote, bringers scandal upon ye truth, he must be summoned to explain himself and publicly apologize to the community and its leaders. By the end of this public humiliation, Daniel walked out of the Burlington Meeting House, a house he helped build, feeling embarrassed and disillusioned. He no longer felt welcome amongst his chosen people. Despite this, he tried again. His next almanac was called the Temple of Wisdom, but the Quaker leaders again didn't want any of this wisdom. History repeated itself almost down to the letter. Today, one copy of the Temple of Wisdom can be found in the Pennsylvania Historical Society collection. But Daniel Leeds wasn't about to take this lying down. As author Brian Regal stated in the 192nd episode of the podcast Ben Franklin's World, quote, rather than spending the rest of his life as a wise old owl imparting wisdom, he decides to turn himself into a political attack dog. The rose-colored glasses had been ripped off, and he'd make sure that others knew the truth about the Quaker leadership of the New Jersey area. Now, as Regal points out, it isn't exactly a big deal in the modern day to call someone a devil. Quote, it's almost adorable. It's almost cute. However, in the early 1700s, this was an incredibly serious accusation. Other Quaker defenders piled on, Leeds firing back that Quakerism carried, quote, only the pretense of Christianity. Something you should know about these correctional meetings that Daniel was summoned to was that the Quakers did not let anyone plead their case at these meetings. They claimed that this was a way to devolve their civilized meetings into a circus. To put it bluntly, it was a strictly one-sided public thrashing. And because of how Quakers conducted those meetings, it left a lot of emotions and words unsaid, emotions that couldn't stay buried. Explosive arguments would happen when people met in person on the street. Leeds would blow up publicly on many Quaker leaders, soon garnering him the reputation as being the most hated man in Burlington. This hatred towards Daniel seemed to confirm to him that he was an underdog, fighting against an unjust religious authority. He and his publisher decided to release his almanacs instead as pamphlets, which was very popular back at a time when printing was incredibly expensive. In the early 1690s, a major schism within the Quakers would create a great opportunity for Leeds's beliefs to infiltrate into the community. Leeds was delighted, energetically pushing his anti-Quaker agenda in his writings, adding fuel to the fire. In the midst of all of this happening, his family settled in Leeds Point. But Daniel wasn't done. If there was anyone who didn't outright hate Daniel, they did when he aligned himself with the British Crown. Now that he was counselor to Governor Lord Cornbury, he and his brother-in-law, Thomas Revel, convinced Cornbury to reject 3 Quaker men from serving in a local election. This was a successful attempt to prevent the Quakers from gaining even more power in New Jersey. Daniel would continue creating almanacs until 1716, when he passed his mission on to his sons, Titan and Felix. 4 years later, Daniel Leeds quietly passed away, leaving us with Titan Leeds. Titan Leeds shared his father's enthusiasm for science, but he wasn't as eager to argue with everyone in the Sun. I kind of feel bad for Titan. He didn't just inherit his father's life's work, but now he had to protect that life's work from all of the powerful enemies that his father had made. Poor Titan soon found himself to be saddled with the title of Satan's Harbinger, which was not a reputation that was easy to shake off. In 1728, Titan replaced the Leeds family crest. This crest would be a French-style shield shape with a black belt across the middle. Above were 2 figures, one below. All of these figures? They were each winged creatures, sporting clawed feet and a pointy tail, meant to represent valor. It's theorized that these were meant to be single-headed eagles, which were popular in English heraldry. But over the top of the shield is a cockatrice. A cockatrice would have been well known in myth as a 2-legged dragon. And admittedly, if you look at his crest, the crest is so small and muddled that it's difficult to make out exactly what animal it is. Either way, the crest was printed over the title of the almanac. Things are definitely starting to pull together, yeah? It's here that we bump into someone familiar. As mentioned, publishing almanacs was quite popular at the time, so why wouldn't publisher Benjamin Franklin try his hand? He realized very early on that fake news, scandals, and outrageous claims could sell a book faster than anything else. Where the Leedsmen took their almanac very seriously, Ben wrote under the name Poor Richard Saunders, and seemed to write more to entertain himself and readers rather than to share any serious sort of information. Where to start? Franklin claimed to have made his own astrological computations. When he did these computations, he wrote that he discovered that his friend Titan Leeds would die in 1736. Franklin thought he was writing very obvious satire, poking at Titan all in good fun. But as we've seen, the Leeds men took any threat to their already battered and sore reputation very seriously. Franklin's joke soared right over Titan's head. Titan responds in public writings with the equivalent of, "Well, I don't know who this Franklin guy is, but he's a liar, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm still alive." I don't know if I'd necessarily call Franklin a bully per se, but his strategy was the same. Every time Titan flared up and responded, Franklin would keep a straight face and continue poking the bear. Quite a few times when Franklin wrote about the Leeds family, he'd link them to Satan. Far from believing in such things, Franklin did this primarily to discredit their almanac, therefore directing people towards his own. Aside from being his competition, Franklin hated astrologers, frequently writing about them satirically. When you look at all of these attacks from Franklin, sure, Titan missed the satire in Franklin's writing, but he honestly didn't have any choice but to respond to the slander. The results were just what Franklin wanted: more people purchasing his almanacs. On Titan's part, it must have been impossible not to be bitter, as his father's life's work was quickly left in the dust, shrinking in the shadow of Ben Franklin's almanac. Even after Titan Leeds passed away in 1738, Ben Franklin couldn't just seem to let things be, and it might have been here that he crossed the moral line. He published a fake letter that he claimed had been written by the dead Titan Leeds. He wrote on, of his faux misery that his friend had returned only to torment his poor friend Franklin, which Regal describes in the Ben Franklin's World podcast. Quote, "You know, I don't know who this is that's yelling at me, but I was really good friends with Titan Leeds, and he would never say such horrible things about me. Therefore, this must be the ghost of Titan Leeds, that Titan Leeds is dead, and this is his ghost come back to haunt me." For the most part, Daniel and Titan Leeds were forgotten or covered up. We still don't really know where they're buried. It's widely believed that Daniel was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Burlington, although church archives and a search of the grounds themselves have turned up nothing. Titan Leeds is believed to be buried in the Quaker burial grounds of Shrewsbury, New Jersey, but no records or headstone confirm this. Despite society's best efforts to erase the Leedses entirely, the family would manage to remain politically influential. Jeremiah Leeds became Atlantic City's first permanent settler, establishing Leeds Plantation where he grew rye and corn. In 1839, Millie, Jeremiah's widow, expanded the plantation's log cabin into a hotel and tavern, the first in the area. In 1854, Atlantic City's first mayor was Chalkley Leeds. We have a decent amount of history, but when and how does the Jersey Devil weave itself permanently into the family name? So the summary of this entire theory is slander. At the end of the day, colonial America was a land that men were fighting tooth and nail over. Everything was up in the air, and there was such a large variety of people and religions, all duking it out to stake a claim, things got nasty in a hurry. As Brian Regal puts it, quote, "The reality is colonial America is built on a kind of raw, bare-knuckle political infighting that would make the stuff that goes on today seem almost tame by comparison. Lying about each other, undermining each other's positions, calling each other names. It was quite a kind of raucous and riotous time that never really ends. And that this part of our national origins, and that people became convinced that monsters were running around. And whether it was the monster of the empire, or an actual monster with fangs and leathery wings in the woods, this is one of the ways that people deal with disappointment, with crumbling careers, with things not going the way you want them to go. The idea of scapegoating political figures. A decent amount of people were certainly jealous of the Leeds family's political success as well as social standing. Daniel made such a big show of hating the Quakers that Quaker leadership was desperate to discredit him. Because, believe it or not, Daniel did have supporters. Where most enemies of any large religion are usually not much of a problem, especially by the time the church was done with them, this family remained influential, many leadsmen holding positions of power. So how was Quaker leadership going to permanently cast doubt on the Leeds family name? They'd already called him a devil or a servant of the devil, but that clearly wasn't enough. And as it turns out, humans have always been the same. Publicly and officially, the Quaker stance on witchcraft and the occult was to avoid it if possible, though they looked down on it as being foolish rather than dangerous. To be clear, they didn't condemn or execute witches, they were notably absent from the witch trials in Salem, but they definitely couldn't approve of anything possibly related to the devil. But in private, they actually loved ghost stories and were fascinated with the theorized behavior of witches. So their claim of Daniel being a servant of the devil may have actually ended up biting them in the ass, accidentally prompting even more interest in Daniel Leeds and his almanac. I can imagine that owning his almanac or pamphlets was a secret thrill of many a Quaker. People didn't have to look far for signs of evil once Titan changed their family crest. The animals or beasts on the crest are so difficult to make out that it was easy for the Quaker leadership to claim that the Leeses were so brazen as to print their own monster on their almanac. Then you throw in the idea of a cursed child, and remember, cursed children were then believed to be the physical embodiment of someone within the family having committed a great sin, and the story almost writes itself. But it's important that we note that there are two devil stories at play here. There's a Leeds devil story, and then later there's a Jersey devil story. The Leeds devil comes from the slander that the Quakers and other writers practiced against Daniel Leeds. The family isn't to be trusted. Daniel Leeds is a servant of the devil or is one himself. Then you've got the crest by Titan Leeds and so on. Decades, centuries go by. By the early 19th century, the Leeds family drama was almost entirely forgotten, leaving behind a kind of shadowy devil figure in the woods of New Jersey. Throw in the confused perceptions of the Lenapes' beliefs, as well as the then popular fascination with monstrous births, and now that shadowy devil figure is horrifically reborn into a more corporeal form. Brian Regal says that the first mention of the Jersey Devil in print was from the 1840s, quite a while after Daniel's time. The author had traveled through New Jersey to find and record stories of the Pineys. He came across Hannah Butler, who offhandedly told him about the Leeds Devil, but partway through the story, she seemed to remember that he was an outsider and she was saying too much, so she left. But the seeds of a fascinating story had been planted. This author wrote about the Leeds Devil, a creature in the woods. This permanently transformed the Leeds Devil from a contentious political or religious figure into a real flesh and blood monster that would go on to evolve for decades into what we know it today, the Jersey Devil. One of the most compelling theories about the origin of the Jersey Devil is that it's the product of jealousy, fascination with the occult, slander, fragmented indigenous beliefs, and centuries of rumors. It might not be as fun as a monster running through the woods, but researching this crazy path has certainly been one of the most interesting journeys. It really highlights how small decisions amongst a large number of people can grow to be that tidal wave of change, even into the monstrous. Our last theory is much shorter, but certainly not unfamiliar. If you go back and listen to the versions of the Jersey Devil story, an identical note can be found in almost all of them, with perhaps an exception or two. Mrs. Leeds somehow summoned this horrible fate upon her child. In over a dozen versions of the same story, Mrs. Leeds shoulders the blame. Even if we look to a few stories where Mother Leeds isn't a witch or an agent of evil, what are the other things she does to earn her family's ruin? Oh, right. She rejects a clergyman attempting to convert her to his religion. Sometimes she isn't even rejecting the religion, she just doesn't want to talk to him in that moment. It's interesting, because a supposed man of God inflicts this curse upon her, yet she is still the one portrayed as evil and deserving of punishment. Also, the hypocrisy of how witches inflicting curses is the work of the devil, but a clergyman doing the same thing is somehow justified is incredibly frustrating. In another version, Mrs. Leeds is a much younger lady who prefers going to key social events as opposed to staying home to fulfill, quote, the duties of married life. Because Mrs. Leeds represents all of the fears that religious authorities had about witches, non-Christians, and women in general. Quote, she's an outsider, rural, uneducated, and prone to supernatural and superstitious beliefs, and who has sex with the devil. Particularly for religions that prize having as many children as possible, this is a woman who has outright rejected her purpose in life. She's a mother who's supposed to be raising her children, but along the way, she's chosen to turn from her offspring, steering her family towards ruin. And at her worst, she's committed the ultimate cruelty of not caring or outright hating her own child. This story is the epitome of scaring people to stay in your lane and fulfill your duty. The father isn't usually mentioned, in my opinion, because raising children isn't really the man's job. Whether he's in town earning an honest living or murdering the neighbor's livestock, it doesn't really matter. Raising children and maintaining the home isn't his job. Lest we forget that Mrs. Leeds was a real person. Cynthia Lamb is the 10th generation granddaughter of Deborah Leeds. Cynthia reports, quote, my research leads me to believe that Mother Leeds was a healer and a midwife and a witch in the truest sense of the word. Not a worshiper of Satan, but a practitioner of the old religion, the pagan religion that underlies Christianity. The only part of those descriptors that others would have been okay with would be that she was a midwife. But it wasn't exactly uncommon for midwives to be on the receiving end of witch accusations. And one could look at Mrs. Leeds' verbal curse, quote, let this one be a devil, as a kind of spell. Folklorist Lynn McNeil says, quote, casual blasphemy, casual cursing is not something that you play with. And this is all over the world, in a lot of different belief systems, that saying something brings it about. The speaking of words is powerful. I find it ironic that although history has Daniel Leeds, Mr. Leeds, being the person that poked the bear that was religious leadership, it's Mrs. Leeds who's somehow at fault. Somehow, the stories write that Mrs. Leeds was a servant of the devil, that she turned her back on God and doomed her own child and family. Make it make sense how Daniel Leeds got to have explosive arguments, both written and in the streets, but history lets him quietly fade away, or to be remembered for his political power, while dragging Mrs. Leeds into the spotlight to be condemned. We mentioned that sometimes Mrs. Leeds is given the first name Jane, the name of Daniel's fourth wife, despite none of the wives having done anything wrong from what my research turned up. I'll let Mr. Regal wrap up the conclusion of this theory. Quote, this is all something that our country is based on. I mean, the whole idea of Mother Leeds. And we sort of equated Mother Leeds in a rough kind of way with Anne Hutchinson, the colonial political activist up in Boston, that you have this idea that women who speak out, women who want to make their voices heard, women who feel they should be treated equally, are seen as pariahs within the society. This is something that is still very topical. The idea that there are those in society who think women should shut up and know their place. And if they don't, they should be punished. In large part, the story of Mother Leeds is that this is an outspoken woman who is punished by God by being forced to bear this monstrous child. And so these are all ideas that are still relevant today and still haunt us. Is the Jersey Devil good or evil? Apart from the variety of answers that the stories give us, it seems to depend on what the Jersey Devil represents for you. While he definitely started as a cautionary tale, that has evolved into a one-of-a-kind monster supported by local pride. And that monster is yet another creature whose legacy seems to have outgrown the insanity of its sightings, being a mixed bag when it comes to how locals and people in general view him. Folk singer and puppeteer Jim Albertson reported a number of Jersey Devil stories where it isn't a malicious monster, but more of a trickster. Quote, somebody who did wrong to a neighbor, and a couple of days later found his outhouse turned upside down. By local accounts, it was the Jersey Devil exacting a little revenge for the wrongdoing. Albertson observed that the further north of Leeds Point you go, the more benevolent the Jersey Devil becomes. As mentioned before, during the Great Depression, a scattering of stories described him as a Robin Hood figure, delivering food to those in need. I've found that frequently, when there's a grotesque monster involved, there's always at least a chunk of the population who relates to it. The Pineys were shunned and disregarded as uneducated, filthy tramps. So why wouldn't they mold this monster into a friend? They certainly knew what it's like to be elbowed to the outskirts of society. The Jersey Devil stories were also passed down from generation to generation, becoming part of their families' legacies. Twice Governor of New Jersey and U.S. Senator Walter Edge says, quote, when I was a boy in Atlantic City, I was never threatened with the boogeyman. No one was down there. We were threatened with the Jersey Devil, morning, noon, and night. Geraldine Witt of Penns Grove says, quote, I remember the Jersey Devil when I was 13 years old, and that was our mother's way of getting us kids to come home after dark. The Jersey Devil had 2 hooves like a cow and was built like a man. It was very tall, naked, and full of long hair. We were pretty scared of the Jersey Devil in the late 1920s. The Jersey Devil could even slip through keyholes. This threat worked well, making children afraid to misbehave. Exploiting this fear, a few Delaware Township, now Cherry Hill Township, farmers painted footprints on the sides and roofs of their barns and proclaimed them to be the work of the Jersey Devil. This practice tended to keep mischievous children away. The book, The Jersey Devil, describes the kind of feeling you get when you gather around the campfire to hear ghost stories. Quote, each year, millions of visitors drive down the Garden State Parkway or the Atlantic City Expressway to the Jersey Shore resorts. Most of them are oblivious to the seemingly endless tracts of forest they're passing through and unaware of events that have transpired there. Some South Jerseyites, however, still have somewhere in mind the hint of a belief that this region is not so empty and serene as it may seem. When they drive these highways, they take comfort from the yellow call boxes which turn up every mile or so, and they believe they know why those emergency phones are placed so closely together. It is not, they will tell you, just for assistance with automotive difficulties, but the possibility of something else out there in the woods. In 1939, the book New Jersey, A Guide to Its Past and Present, proclaimed the Jersey Devil to be the official state demon. Of course, once the outside world started to hear about this monster, it wasn't going to belong to the locals forever. The Jersey Devil soon saw a long and ongoing legacy of becoming a literal mascot. 1960, the Jersey Devil became the Madison campus of Farley Dickinson University mascot, which later changed to simply the Devils. In 1964, the Philadelphia Ramblers hockey team moved to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, also adopting the Jersey Devil as their mascot. The Lakehurst area's women's wrestling team named themselves the Jersey Devil Women's Wrestlers in 1980. Several times a week, they'd perform a dancing show, followed by mud wrestling. 1982, the Colorado Rockies National Hockey League team moved to North Jersey. When asked to rename the team, the fans arose in a wave to scream, "New Jersey Devils!" If a sports team, however minor, resides in New Jersey and doesn't have the Jersey Devil as its mascot, you'd get some odd looks, and I'm not sure I can name them all. I'll finish the list with the Jersey Devil Dune Buggy Club that formed in 1978. The 15 members of this club would drive cut-down Volkswagens and appear in parades and charity events. Linda Reddington wrote the poem The Jersey Devil, which detailed the birth of the monster. The insane week of 1909 specifically inspired the creation of award-winning The Ballad of the Jabberwock by Leah Bodine Drake. Congrats to Drake, because it went on to win the Stephen Vincent Benet Ballad Contest in 1946. Bruce Springsteen released the blues song A Night with the Jersey Devil for Halloween 2008. Some people have created a number of local drinks dedicated to the Jersey Devil. A common note on each recipe is to drink it slowly and with food, as everyone seemed to have a competition to see who could make the strongest drink. Most of the drinks strictly require cranberries and/or cranberry juice specifically from the Pine Barrens. Bill Thompson created what he says is the most potent Jersey Devil drink. Thompson firmly claimed that if you finished his drink, he guaranteed that there would be an appearance of the Jersey Devil. The list of documentaries on the monster is long. Monster Quest, Lost Tapes, True Monsters. In 1993, The X-Files had an episode where locals around Atlantic City believed that a collection of murders of the transient population are actually the work of the Jersey Devil. It turns out that there are two hairy humanoids, but they aren't Bigfoot, Big Feet, whatever, but are instead members of the Leeds family. Quote, "It seems that no self-respecting television series on monsters could do without segments on the flying dragon from the Pine Barrens." Not exactly the legacy Daniel Leeds was shooting for. Look, as I see it, there's too much to ignore. Let's say half of the incidents, particularly during the week of 1909, were mass hysteria. And hey, let's say half of what's left are people who are lying or exaggerating to get in on the fun or scavenge up some fame. Let's say half of that are pranksters who are just in it for the mischief. Yet again, let's say half of what remains is misidentification. That still leaves a ton of unexplained sightings and experiences. Do I believe that there's a kangaroo, horse, dragon, demon out in the dark corners of the Pine Barrens? Well, I haven't been there yet, so I can't tell ya. But what I do know is that this patchwork monster certainly matters to the people of the area, and even pop culture at large now. And discussing its origins has let us talk about the history of the area, as well as some groups that were pushed down for far too long. Either way, the mere suggestion of the existence of monsters and their stories can tell us a lot. I can't say it better than Daniel Rich. Quote, "The Jersey Devil is a slice of the past, preserved and constantly renewed by the imagination of the Jerseyites. To lose him is to lose a piece of identity and touch with our origins. The Jersey Devil is to us what the Loch Ness Monster is to Scotland. In the face of heightened industrialization and technology, the Jersey Devil is the archetypal fear in us all. The fear of the dark, the unknown, and the shaded areas within ourselves." And so ends the Jersey Devil saga. Again, thank you for being so patient about this last episode taking a while. Having only one person running the show means that I have a lot of freedom, but when something goes wrong, that one person has to fix everything. And hopefully this extra long episode is a decent apology.
I have so many plans, so be sure to follow the podcast socials for those announcements. You can find those links in the description, as well as how you can support the show. And as always, thank you for listening.